December 12, 1942. Over the French countryside near Rouen, Lieutenant Paul Flickinger fought to keep his crippled Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress in the air. Smoke poured from the No. 3 engine. Hydraulic fluid streamed behind the aircraft in a visible trail. German fighters had savaged his bomber during the attack on the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards, and now, separated from his formation and losing altitude, Flickinger faced an impossible choice. The B-17F, nicknamed Wolfhound, was bleeding to death in the winter sky. Through breaks in the clouds below, Flickinger could see the patchwork of French fields and the silver thread of the Rhine River system. His crew of 9 men looked to him for salvation. Behind them, somewhere in the grey European afternoon, lay England and safety. Ahead, nothing but occupied territory and capture. Then, through his damaged windscreen, Flickinger saw it. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter from Nachtjägergeschwader 1 materialized off his port wing. The twin-engine fighter could have finished them with a single burst from its cannon. Instead, the German pilot made a gesture that was unmistakable even across the gulf of sky between them. "Lower your landing gear. Surrender. Live." Flickinger looked at his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping, fuel gauges falling, altitude bleeding away. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. He reached for the landing gear lever and pulled. The wheels dropped into the slipstream with a shudder that ran through the entire airframe. The Bf-110 pilot nodded and banked gently, leading the damaged fortress toward Leeuwarden airfield in the Netherlands. As Flickinger nursed his dying bomber across the Dutch coastline, he had no way of knowing that he was about to deliver the single most valuable intelligence gift to the Luftwaffe of the entire year. Wolfhound was about to become the first intact Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress captured by German forces. Within 48 hours, German engineers would be crawling through every compartment of his aircraft. Within 2 weeks, German test pilots would be flying it. Within 6 months, the secrets extracted from this one bomber would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe fighter tactics across the entire European theatre. And the discovery that would shock German pilots more than any other was waiting in plain sight, bristling from every angle of the aircraft they had been fighting for months. The Americans had built a bomber that could shoot back from virtually everywhere simultaneously. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey that led to this moment had begun across the Atlantic Ocean, in a Boeing factory in Seattle, Washington, where engineers were wrestling with a problem that seemed mathematically impossible. How do you defend a bomber that must fly straight and level during its bomb run, presenting itself as a target for fighters that can attack from any angle at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour? The answer Boeing developed was revolutionary and expensive. Instead of relying on speed or altitude alone, they would transform the bomber itself into a mobile fortress, bristling with enough firepower to make attacking it a calculated risk rather than an easy kill. The B-17's defensive philosophy was simple in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Cover every approach angle with overlapping fields of fire from multiple gun positions. When the Boeing Model 299 prototype first flew on July 28, 1935, a Seattle Times reporter named Richard Williams observed the aircraft on the ground and coined a phrase that would echo through history. He described it as a 15-ton flying fortress in a photo caption. Boeing immediately recognized the propaganda value and trademarked the name. The Flying Fortress was born. But that original prototype carried only 5 machine guns, all .30 caliber, with severely limited fields of fire. It was a fortress in name only. Combat experience in the early years of World War II, particularly observations of British daylight bombing attempts over Europe, taught brutal lessons about what happened to inadequately defended bombers. They died quickly and in horrifying numbers. The United States Army Air Forces watched these disasters unfold and drew the correct conclusion. Bombers attacking in daylight needed overwhelming defensive firepower. As America geared up for war, Boeing engineers began a systematic program of adding guns, armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks to the B-17 design. Each iteration carried more weapons, Each version became more lethal to the fighters that attacked it. The B-17C model that entered service in 1941 carried 450 caliber machine guns and one 30 caliber nose gun. Better than the tank prototype, but still inadequate against determined fighter attack. The B-17D added 2 more 50 caliber guns and improved armor, bringing the total to 6 50 caliber weapons. Progress, but still vulnerable from too many angles. The B-17E, entering service in September 1942, represented a quantum leap. The tail was redesigned with a larger vertical stabilizer for improved stability. More importantly, the defensive armament expanded dramatically to 10 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns positioned to cover attacks from virtually every angle. This was the model that began operations over Europe in 1942, and this was the baseline that Wolfhound represented when it fell into German hands in December. But even the E model had a glaring weakness that Luftwaffe pilots were already exploiting. The nose of the aircraft, where the bombardier and navigator worked, was defended by only a few hand-operated guns firing through small openings in the plexiglass. A determined fighter pilot, attacking head-on, faced minimal defensive fire and could strike the cockpit directly, killing or wounding the pilots and sending the bomber down immediately. German fighter ace Egon Meyer had discovered this vulnerability in November 1942, just 1 month before Wolfhound's capture. Attacking from 12 o'clock high, boring directly into the bomber's nose at a combined closing speed exceeding 500 miles per hour, Meyer found he could deliver devastating fire before the bomber's defensive guns could respond effectively. The head-on attack required steel nerves and perfect timing, but it worked. By December 1942, head-on attacks were becoming the preferred Luftwaffe tactic against B-17 formations. Casualties among American bomber crews were mounting steadily. Pilots, co-pilots, bombardiers, and navigators in the forward fuselage were being killed in horrific numbers. The bomber was formidable from every other angle, but from dead ahead, it was vulnerable. This was the tactical situation when Wolfhound touched down at Leeuwarden on December 12th. Flickinger and his crew were marched away to prisoner-of-war camps. They would spend the next 2.5 years behind barbed wire, and Flickinger would carry a burden of guilt for the rest of his life. He had delivered an intact flying fortress to the enemy. He had given them everything they needed to study, analyze, and ultimately defeat his fellow airmen still fighting over Europe. The bomber sat on the tarmac for exactly 2 days, while German mechanics conducted temporary repairs. On December 14th, a German crew climbed aboard, fired up the 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, and prepared for one of the most dangerous test flights of the war. Wolfhound would fly deep into Germany, escorted by 2 Bf-110 fighters, heading for the Luftwaffe's most important test facility at Rechlin near Berlin. The flight itself was extraordinary. Luftwaffe fighter bases and flak units along the route had been notified, but miscommunications in wartime are inevitable. Despite German markings hastily painted over the American stars, Wolfhound was fired upon by German anti-aircraft guns during the flight. The B-17 took minor additional damage but made it safely to Rechlin. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The bomber that had survived German fighters over France had nearly been shot down by German flak over Germany. At Rechlin, the real work began. The facility was Germany's equivalent to America's Wright Field, the center of Luftwaffe aviation testing and development. Every captured Allied aircraft of significance eventually found its way to Rechlin. Spitfires, P-51 Mustangs, Avro Lancasters, Soviet fighters. The hangars were a museum of enemy aviation technology, and each aircraft revealed secrets that could be exploited. But Wolfhound was special. It was the first intact flying fortress they had captured. Previous B-17 seconds had been shot down and crashed, leaving only wreckage to analyze. This bomber was complete and flyable. Everything worked, every system could be tested. Every gun position could be evaluated. It was an intelligence treasure beyond measure. The lead test pilot, assigned to evaluate Wolfhound, was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche, a 38-year-old engineer and pilot who would eventually fly more than 120 different aircraft types during his career. Lerche was uniquely qualified for the task. He had trained as a glider pilot in his youth, earned his engineering degree, and become one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and skilled test pilots. He approached every captured aircraft with the same systematic thoroughness, documenting every detail with an engineer's precision. Lerche had no pilot's manual for the B-17, no technical documentation, no checklist. Everything he learned by doing. It was a testament to his skill that throughout his entire career, he never crashed or even seriously damaged a single aircraft he tested, whether German or captured Allied. But even Lerche, with all his experience, was unprepared for what he would discover about the flying fortress. Before Lerche would fly Wolfhound, ground crews and engineers conducted an exhaustive examination of every system. They measured, they photographed, they took apart components and reassembled them. They wanted to understand not just how the aircraft worked, but why it was designed the way it was. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they knew about American aviation engineering. The four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines each produced 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. Reliable, powerful, air-cooled radials that could absorb significant battle damage and keep running. The Germans used liquid-cooled engines in many of their designs, which were more efficient but vulnerable to coolant leaks. A single bullet through a coolant line could doom an engine. The American air-cooled approach was rugged and simple, engineering for reliability over perfection. The superchargers were exhaust-driven turbines that became more efficient at high altitude, exactly when more power was needed. This technology allowed the B-17 to operate effectively at 25,000 feet or higher, above much of the German flak. The Germans had nothing comparable in their bomber force. It was a revelation to German engine experts who examined the system carefully, taking detailed notes. The self-sealing fuel tanks were another marvel. Multiple rubber layers that swelled when punctured by bullets, automatically sealing small holes and preventing catastrophic fuel loss. German bombers lacked this technology. A single incendiary bullet in a fuel tank could transform a bomber into a fireball. The Americans had engineered a solution that saved countless lives. The German engineers examining Wolfhound could see the value immediately and wished desperately that their own aircraft had similar protection. The armor plating throughout the aircraft was strategically positioned to protect the crew from the most likely attack angles. Steel plates behind the pilot's seats, armored glass in portions of the windscreen, protection around the engines and oil coolers. It added weight, yes, but it kept crews alive to fight another day. The Germans recognized the philosophy immediately. The Americans were willing to sacrifice some performance for survivability. But it was the defensive armament that truly stunned every German officer and pilot who examined the aircraft. 10 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns positioned throughout the airframe. Let that number sink in for a moment. 10 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 700 rounds per minute, each with an effective range of 600 to 700 yards in air-to-air combat. The Browning M2 was a remarkable weapon, designed by John Browning in 1918 and refined through the 1920s and 30s. It fired a cartridge that was 5.47 inches long, weighed 1.71 ounces, and could penetrate armor at remarkable distances. The muzzle velocity was 2,910 feet per second. At combat ranges, these guns could tear through aircraft aluminum like paper and could even damage armored components with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The ammunition variety was sophisticated. Tracer rounds tipped with red paint for aiming, incendiary rounds tipped with blue for starting fires in fuel tanks and engines, armor-piercing incendiary rounds tipped with silver for punching through protected areas, plain armor-piercing rounds tipped with black for pure penetration. Gunners loaded their ammunition belts with specific patterns of these rounds to maximize effectiveness against different targets. German engineers examining Wolfhound went through the aircraft systematically, documenting each gun position with photographs and detailed drawings. They wanted to understand not just where the guns were, but what they could cover, how they overlapped, and where the dead zones might be. Starting at the front, The bombardier's station in the plexiglass nose had access to flexible 50 caliber guns that could be moved between different mounting points. These were hand-operated, fired by the bombardier when he wasn't actively bombing, or by the navigator when enemy fighters approached from the front quadrant. The guns had limited range of motion and required constant repositioning, but they provided some defense against the deadly head-on attacks. Just behind and above the cockpit, the top turret mounted two 50 caliber guns in a powered, rotating turret that could traverse 360 degrees and elevate to track targets above and to the sides of the aircraft. The flight engineer typically manned this position when not managing the engines. The turret was hydraulically powered and could move at astonishing speed, 50 degrees per second. A skilled gunner could literally sign his name with the gun barrels if he placed a pencil in one. Behind the top turret, in the radio compartment, another flexible 50 caliber gun pointed upward and rearward through an opening in the fuselage top. The radio operator manned this weapon when not managing communications. It covered the vulnerable area above and behind the wing, where fighters sometimes attacked. The ball turret underneath the fuselage was perhaps the most remarkable gun position on any bomber of the war. A Sperry-designed sphere, approximately 4 feet in diameter, mounted flush to the belly, it contained two 50 caliber guns and rotated 360 degrees with the gunner inside. The ball turret gunner, typically one of the smallest crew members, would crouch into a fetal position while entering through a hatch from inside the fuselage, then sit in the sphere with his knees pulled up, operating the guns and turret rotation with hand controls. It was claustrophobic, terrifying, and absolutely vital for defense against attacks from below. Moving aft, two waist gunners stood at open windows on each side of the fuselage, each manning a flexible 50 caliber gun. These positions defended against beam attacks from the sides. The openings were unheated, and at operational altitudes of 25,000 feet or higher, the temperature could drop to 42 degrees below zero. Waist gunners wore electrically heated suits and oxygen masks, exposed to the screaming wind and the very real possibility of being hit by enemy fire. Finally, at the extreme rear of the aircraft, the tail gunner sat in isolation, separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage. His position mounted two 50 caliber guns, specifically to defend against the classic stern attack that German fighters had used so effectively in the early part of the war. The tail position was perhaps the most psychologically demanding on the aircraft. Completely alone, unable to easily communicate with the rest of the crew, watching enemy fighters line up for attacks directly toward him, the tail gunner needed nerves of steel. When German engineers added up the ammunition capacity, they found that Wolfhound carried approximately 7,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed among these 10 gun positions. That was enough sustained firepower to engage multiple attackers for several minutes of continuous combat. The nose guns had about 300 rounds each. The top turret had 400 rounds per gun. The radio gun had 200 rounds. The ball turret had 500 rounds per gun. The waist guns had 1,200 rounds each, the largest allocation of any position. The tail guns had 565 rounds each, 7,000 rounds of heavy machine gun ammunition. Think about what that meant tactically. A B-17 could throw metal into the sky continuously during an extended engagement. And when B-17 seconds flew in the combat box formations the Americans had developed, with multiple bombers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, the defensive firepower was absolutely staggering. A typical combat box formation placed 54 B-17 seconds in a carefully staggered arrangement. Lead squadron high, second squadron in the middle, third squadron low, each squadron in a slightly offset position to provide clear fields of fire. When German fighters attacked such a formation, they flew into a concentration of defensive firepower that was difficult to fully grasp until experienced firsthand. German pilots called it the Wall of Fire. Approaching a B-17 formation from any angle meant flying through tracers that seemed to fill the entire sky. Red streaks that marked the path of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The sound was deafening, the visual overwhelming, and the metal filling the air was lethal. Major Anton Haeckel, a Luftwaffe ace who would end the war with 192 confirmed victories, described the experience in his post-war memoirs. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period, closing from 1,000 meters to our firing range of 400 meters, when the bombers were firing at us, but we could not effectively return fire. The Americans' Browning .50 caliber machine guns had a higher muzzle velocity and greater range than our MG-17 seconds. We were under fire for what seemed like an eternity. Another Luftwaffe pilot, describing his first encounter with a B-17 formation, wrote in his combat report that the size of the heavy bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to a green pilot. They had to be experienced firsthand. The bomber gunners opened fire as soon as a target was seen, in order to disrupt or ward off attacks. Our cockpits were surrounded by red tracers, swarming like wasps, long before we could open fire effectively. Because of the low closing speed on a stern attack, this extremely uncomfortable situation could continue for several minutes. The phrase German pilots used among themselves was telling. Attacking a B-17 formation from behind was like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. The defensive firepower was simply overwhelming from the rear quadrant. Tail guns, ball turret guns, waist guns, top turret guns that could rotate to fire aft. All of these positions could bring fire to bear on a fighter approaching from behind. The concentration of firepower made the classic stern attack, which had worked so well against British bombers, almost suicidal against American formations. When Luftwaffe fighter pilots examined captured B-17 seconds and analyzed combat camera footage, they discovered a sobering statistic. It took an average pilot approximately 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells fired from the rear to reliably bring down a B-17. 20 hits. Not 20 rounds fired, but 20 actual hits. And analysis showed that the average Luftwaffe pilot hit his target with only about 2% of the rounds he fired in combat. The mathematics were brutal. To achieve 20 hits required firing 1,020mm rounds at a single bomber. The best German fighter, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Even if every round hit, which was impossible, a single fighter couldn't carry enough ammunition to guarantee a kill on a B-17 attacking from the stern. This discovery had profound implications for Luftwaffe tactics. Attacking from behind was simply not sustainable. Too much defensive fire, too much ammunition required, too high a loss rate among fighter pilots. They needed a different approach, and the vulnerability Egon Meyer had discovered in November 1942 became even more critical. The head-on attack, boring directly into the bomber's nose at 12 o'clock, offered the best chance of a quick kill with minimal exposure to defensive fire. The combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour meant that both the fighter and the bomber were in each other's firing range for only a few seconds. It required extraordinary pilot skill and iron nerves. But it worked. And it struck the most vulnerable area of the aircraft, the forward fuselage where the pilots sat. This was the tactical situation when Hans-Werner Lersch climbed into the cockpit of Wolfhound for his first test flight in early spring of 1943. German engineers had spent 3 months examining every detail of the aircraft. Now it was time to fly it and understand how it performed in the air. What capabilities did it have? What were its limitations? How should German fighters approach it for maximum effectiveness and minimum risk? Lersch conducted his pre-flight inspection with meticulous care. He walked around the aircraft, checking control surfaces, examining the landing gear, verifying that all access panels were secure. He climbed into the cockpit through the belly hatch and settled into the pilot's seat on the left side. The co-pilot's seat on his right remained empty for this first test flight. He would fly solo to get a feel for the aircraft without distractions. The cockpit was spacious compared to German fighters Lersch was accustomed to. Banks of instruments covered the panel, throttle levers for 4 engines, propeller pitch controls, mixture controls, supercharger controls, landing gear lever, flap controls, trim tabs. It was complex but laid out logically. American engineering favored clear labeling and intuitive placement. Within minutes, Lercher had mentally mapped where everything was. He ran through the start sequence, firing up each engine in turn. Number 1 engine on the far left, number 2 inboard left, number 3 inboard right, number 4 far right. Each right cyclone radial, caught with a cough of smoke and settled into a steady roar. The sound was distinctive, different from German radials, deeper, more mechanical. Lerch monitored the engine instruments carefully, oil pressure rising into the green, temperatures stabilizing. Everything looked normal. He advanced the throttles slightly and felt the 45-ton bomber begin to move. The tailwheel steering required some getting used to, but Lercher had flown enough tailwheel aircraft to adapt quickly. He weaved back and forth as he taxied, using the rudder to see past the long nose, a technique common to all tailwheel pilots. The bomber felt solid and substantial beneath him, responding predictably to his inputs. At the runway threshold, Lercher completed his final checks. Magnetos tested on each engine, noting the slight RPM drop as he switched between them. Propeller pitch set to fine for takeoff. Mixture rich. Superchargers set appropriately. Trim tabs adjusted for takeoff configuration. Control surfaces checked free and moving correctly through, their full range. Everything ready. He looked down the runway, clear and straight ahead. He advanced all 4 throttles smoothly to full power while holding the brakes. The engines roared. The bomber strained forward. Lercher released the brakes and the B-17 rolled forward, gathering speed quickly despite its considerable weight. At 75 miles per hour, he eased back on the control yoke and the flying fortress lifted gracefully into the air. The initial climb rate was impressive for such a heavy aircraft, over 1,000 feet per minute with full power and no bomb load. The controls felt responsive and well harmonized. Aileron forces were reasonable. Elevator control was positive. Rudder forces were manageable. The aircraft was stable and wanted to fly straight and level. It was a pilot's airplane, forgiving and predictable. Lerch leveled off at 5,000 feet and began the systematic evaluation that was his specialty. He varied the airspeed from minimum to maximum, noting how the controls felt at different speeds. He performed gentle turns left and right, evaluating roll response and coordination. He climbed and descended at various power settings and airspeeds. He extended and retracted the landing gear and flaps, noting the changes in trim and drag. Everything performed as expected. The B-17 was a stable, capable, heavy bomber. But as Lercher explored the flight envelope, he began to truly understand the defensive philosophy Boeing had built into the design. He thought about those 10-50 caliber guns and what they meant for a fighter pilot trying to attack this aircraft. From every angle, there were guns. A fighter approaching from behind would face tail guns, ball turret guns, waist guns, potentially the top turret. A fighter attacking from the side would face waist guns, top turret, possibly the ball turret. A fighter coming from above would face the top turret and radio gun. A fighter attacking from below would face the ball turret. Even, the supposedly vulnerable nose had guns that could be brought to bear, albeit limited. The only truly vulnerable approach was head-on and slightly high, where the forward guns had limited elevation and the top turret couldn't depress low enough to fire forward effectively. But that attack required closing at over 500 miles per hour, giving the fighter pilot perhaps 2 seconds of effective firing time before he had to break away to avoid collision. It was a desperate, dangerous maneuver that only the most skilled and courageous pilots could execute consistently. Lerch flew Wolfhound for over an hour on that first test flight, thoroughly exploring its characteristics. When he landed and climbed out, he wrote in his logbook and began composing his preliminary report. His assessment would eventually run to dozens of pages, but the core conclusion was inescapable. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not just a heavy bomber. It was a mobile fortress that could defend itself with devastating firepower from virtually every angle. The Americans had succeeded in building exactly what the name promised. The defensive armament was the single most impressive aspect of the aircraft. 10 50 caliber machine guns covering overlapping fields of fire. 7,000 rounds of ammunition. gunners positioned to track and engage fighters throughout the approach and attack. When these bombers flew in formation, combining their firepower, they created a defensive perimeter that was extraordinarily difficult to penetrate without sustaining unacceptable losses. German fighter pilots would need new tactics, new weapons, new approaches. The old methods that had worked against British bombers would not work against the flying fortress. Stern attacks were too dangerous. Beam attacks exposed the fighter to too much defensive fire. The only viable approach was head-on, and that required levels of skill and courage that were exhausting to maintain day after day, mission after mission. Wolfhound would remain at Rechlin through July 1943, undergoing continuous testing and evaluation. German engineers studied every detail. Test pilots flew it repeatedly. Fighter pilots were brought in to practice attacks against it, learning where they could approach with the least risk, where the defensive blind spots were, how quickly the gunners could track a fast-moving target. In June 1943, Wolfhound was exhibited at Lairs Airfield during a special display of captured Allied aircraft. German pilots and officers could walk around it, climb inside, sit in the gun positions, and truly understand what they were facing in combat. The exhibition included other captured aircraft: B-24 Liberators, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, Avro Lancasters, de Havilland Mosquitoes, Hawker, Typhoons, and Spitfires. But Wolfhound remained the centerpiece, the aircraft that had started it all. German pilots who attended the exhibition came away with a profound respect for American engineering and a sobering understanding of what they faced. The wall of fire was real. The defensive firepower was not exaggerated. Attacking B-17 formations was one of the most dangerous missions a Luftwaffe pilot could fly. Many would not survive their tours of duty. The attrition rate among German fighter pilots on the Western Front would become unsustainable by late 1943 and into 1944. In September 1943, Wolfhound was transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's special operations unit that operated captured aircraft for covert missions and long-range operations. The B-17 was assigned the new code A3+AE, marking its transition from test aircraft to operational asset. It would fly missions over Soviet territory, Poland, the Mediterranean, and even as far as Palestine and North Africa, carrying agents and supplies to isolated German forces. The aircraft served throughout 1944, accumulating hundreds of flight hours in German hands. Pilots who flew it reported that it was a formidable and reliable aircraft, exactly what the Luftwaffe needed for long-range special operations. The defensive armament meant it could defend itself if intercepted. The range meant it could reach distant targets. The reliability meant missions could be completed with confidence. But Wolfhound's greatest contribution to the German war effort had come in those first 6 months after capture, when it revealed everything the Luftwaffe needed to know about the flying fortress. The intelligence gained from that single aircraft shaped fighter tactics across the entire Western Front and saved countless German fighter pilots from flying blind into a wall of defensive fire they didn't understand. On April 10, 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in Europe, Wolfhound met its final end during an American bombing raid on Oranienburg airfield. The aircraft, that had been captured in December 1942, was destroyed by its former owners in April 1945. The irony was complete. The bomber had come full circle, destroyed by the Air Force that had built it, flown by the enemy that had studied it, and ultimately serving both sides in ways no one could have predicted when it first lifted off from its American airfield that December morning in 1942. Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, who had surrendered Wolfhound to avoid the death of his crew, survived the war as a prisoner. He returned home in 1945 carrying a burden of guilt that would never fully leave him. In interviews decades later, he would say that he always felt responsible for giving the Germans their first intact flying fortress, for providing them with intelligence that may have cost American lives. He never fully accepted that his choice to land rather than fight to the death had saved his crew and was the only rational decision given, impossible circumstances. But the impact of Wolfhound's capture extended far beyond one man's guilt. The intelligence extracted from that single aircraft contributed to a fundamental shift in Luftwaffe tactics that would define the air war over Europe for the next 2 years. German pilots learned exactly what they were facing. They learned where the defensive blind spots were. They learned that head-on attacks, despite their danger, offered the only viable approach to American bomber formations. And ironically, the American response to this German tactical evolution would further validate the Flying Fortress's defensive philosophy. When American commanders realized that B-17E and early F models were vulnerable to head-on attacks, they didn't redesign the aircraft, they simply added more guns. The B-17G, entering service in summer of 1943, would mount 1350 caliber machine guns, including 2 in a new remotely operated chin turret directly below the Bombardier's position for defense against head-on attacks, plus improved cheek guns on both sides of the nose. The vulnerability that Wolfhound had revealed would be systematically addressed with more firepower, more armor, more protection. The fortress would become even more formidable. By mid-1943, the captured B-17 had transformed Luftwaffe understanding completely. German pilots now trained specifically against mock formations, practicing the suicidal head-on passes that offered their only viable attack vector. The cost was staggering. Experienced pilots died weekly, their fighters shredded by defensive fire or destroyed in collision avoidance maneuvers. Meanwhile, American factories churned out B-17Gs faster than Germany could replace lost fighters. Each new fortress carried those 13 guns, eliminating even the frontal vulnerability. The mathematics of attrition had shifted decisively. Wolfhound had revealed both the problem and, inadvertently, confirmed that the American solution, overwhelming defensive firepower, was unbeatable. The lessons learned from Wolfhound forced German engineers into a desperate technological race they were already losing. If the standard 20mm cannon required too many hits and too much ammunition to reliably down a flying fortress, then heavier weapons were needed. The answer came in the form of 30mm cannons. Then, eventually, the enormous 50mm BK-5 cannon mounted in specialized Messerschmitt Bf-109 seconds, and the devastating 30mm Mk-108 cannons carried by the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. These heavier weapons could theoretically destroy a B-17 with just a few hits. A single 30mm high-explosive round striking a critical area could catastrophically damage the bomber. But the weapons came with their own problems. They were heavy, reducing fighter performance. They had lower muzzle velocities, making accurate shooting at high closing speeds nearly impossible. They carried limited ammunition. A Bf-109 equipped with the BK-5 cannon carried only 21 rounds. 21 chances to hit a target while closing at 500 miles per hour under intense defensive fire. The Luftwaffe also experimented with increasingly desperate tactics, aerial ramming attacks, where pilots deliberately struck bombers with their fighters, accepting probable death to guarantee a kill. Bomber destroyers like the heavily armed and armored Focke-Wulf 190A8R2, carrying 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, specifically designed to penetrate bomber formations and survive the defensive fire long enough to destroy multiple aircraft. Twin-engine heavy fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Me-410, mounting batteries of cannons and rockets to engage bombers from beyond defensive gun range. The Germans developed the Werfergranate 21, a massive 210mm rocket that could be fired from tubes, mounted under a fighter's wings. The weapon was inaccurate and nearly useless against maneuvering fighters, but against bomber formations flying straight and level, it could be devastating. A single direct hit from a WGR-21 could blow a B-17 completely apart, but the rockets had to be fired from approximately 1,200 yards, well beyond the range where a pilot could accurately aim while under defensive fire and dealing with the fighter's violent recoil. Nothing worked consistently. Every new weapon system, every new tactic, every innovation was met by American countermeasures: escort fighters with longer range, improved formation tactics, better gunner training, more armor, self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb even 30mm hits, and always more bombers. The American industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. By late 1943, Luftwaffe fighter pilots on the Western Front faced an impossible situation. They were outnumbered. They were outproduced. They were fighting an enemy that could absorb losses and return stronger, while German losses were irreplaceable. Experienced pilots who understood the nuances of attacking B-17 formations were being killed faster than replacement pilots could be trained. The replacement pilots, with minimal flight hours and almost no combat experience, died even faster. The statistics were horrifying. In the second half of 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded on the Western Front. These weren't just numbers. These were the experienced formation leaders, the tactical innovators, the aces who knew how to survive against the flying fortress's defensive firepower. Once they were gone, their knowledge died with them. German pilot Werner Mulders, who died in 1941 before the worst of the bomber offensive, had famously said that it took approximately 10,000 rounds of practice ammunition to produce a competent fighter pilot. By 1944, the Luftwaffe couldn't spare 10,000 rounds for training. New pilots were being sent into combat with perhaps 20 hours of flight time in their assigned aircraft and virtually no gunnery practice. They were expected to execute head-on attacks against bomber formations defended by hundreds of heavy machine guns, flown by experienced American gunners who had survived dozens of missions. The results were predictable. Green German pilots died in astonishing numbers, often on their first or second combat missions. They made basic mistakes that experienced pilots would never commit. They attacked from the wrong angles, exposing themselves to maximum defensive fire. They flew too close and collided with bombers during evasive maneuvers. They fixated on a single target and failed to see the P-51 Mustang diving on them from above. They ran out of ammunition before achieving kills. They panicked when damaged and bailed out over enemy territory when they could have made it home. The flying fortress formations kept coming, hundreds of bombers at a time, flying in broad daylight, protected by swarms of escort fighters with range enough to accompany them all the way to Berlin and back. The missions that Luftwaffe pilots had once intercepted with confidence became slaughter runs, where survival, not victory, was the only realistic goal. American bomber crews weren't immune to the carnage. Casualty rates remained brutal throughout 1943 and into 1944. A bomber crewman's statistical chance of completing a 25-mission combat tour was less than 50%. Being shot down over Germany meant either death, capture, or, if extraordinarily lucky, escape through occupied territory. Frostbite, oxygen deprivation, flak wounds, fighter attacks, mechanical failures, mid-air collisions, and simple accidents killed thousands of American airmen. But the critical difference was that America could sustain those losses. For every bomber shot down, 3 more rolled off assembly lines, in Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach. For every crew lost, replacement crews arrived from training bases in Texas, Arizona, and Florida. The system was industrial, efficient, and relentless. Germany couldn't match it. Every fighter lost was increasingly difficult to replace. Every pilot killed represented training resources that could never be recovered. Every airfield bombed disrupted operations. Every factory hit reduced production. The strategic bombing campaign, which Wolfhound had been part of before its capture, was systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. The irony was complete and devastating. The aircraft that German engineers had studied so carefully, hoping to find weaknesses to exploit, had instead revealed a philosophy of war that Germany couldn't counter. American engineering had created a bomber that could survive long enough to deliver its payload, and American industry had built enough of them to overwhelm any defense. The 13 guns that shocked Luftwaffe pilots were merely the visible symbol of a much larger truth. This was a war of production, and Germany had already lost it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.